Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Thursday, March 2nd, 2023. I'm delighted to be back with Suzy Dodd of JPL. Suzy, at long last, it's great to be back with you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Suzy, in our first conversation, we did a great tour of your research interest and all of your wide-ranging career responsibilities at JPL. Today, let's establish some personal narrative. Let's start first with your parents. Tell me a little bit about them and where they're from.
My parents were both born right outside of New York City in a town called Scarsdale. And my, I can say their parents, on my father's side, the last name is Rosik, Rosik. That's my maiden name. And it hails from the region around the old Czechoslovakia. I think it's actually Slovakia, part piece of it. And so I think my father's grandparents were immigrants to New York City. On my mother's side, they had been in the country back since the days of the Pilgrims, and they're basically some combination of English and a little bit of Welsh and probably some other things. I need to do the 23andMe test, David, and then I'll have a much better history of my folks. But basically, my parents were from the New York City area.
Suzy, what were your
Yeah.
parents' experience during World War II?
Well, on my dad's side, his older brother fought in World War II, and he was killed in the Battle of the Bulge, right kind of before the war ended, and it was on Thanksgiving, so he was supposed to come home like a few weeks after, right before he was killed. And what my father says is that it always made the holiday, especially Thanksgiving, kind of a depressing time.
Yeah.
I can clearly remember one picture, Christmas picture that they had that my grandmother kept her whole life in her house, and it was my father was the middle of three boys, and the picture she had was the two boys, my grandmother, my grandfather, and then on the table next to the Christmas tree was a picture of Bobby in his uniform, acknowledging him as part of the family too. So I don't have a lot of memories related to that though, because well, for one thing, I was born in Washington State, and I can describe how I got over to Washington State, or how my parents got to Washington State. Well, my grandparents were still in the New York area, so we didn't see them as much for little kids. And actually, my grandfather on my dad's side passed away before I was born.
So you were born in Scarsdale?
No, I was born in Tacoma, Washington.
Ah, okay. So how did your parents get out to Washington? Was your father in
Yeah.
aerospace?
No, my father was a business major. He fought in the Korean War for a couple years. And when he came back after 2 years of being a stenographer, his younger brother got married to one of my mother's best friends, and they kind of knew each other from high school. There was a pretty big gap, like one was a senior and one was a freshman, so they didn't really pay a lot of attention to each other. But when they got back, or when my uncle got married, my dad's brother, my dad was the best man, my mother was the maid of honor, and they sort of reconnected, and started dating. So they actually started dating after my aunt and uncle's wedding, and a couple years after that got married. Yeah. But my dad, he had gone to college, and then he got drafted to go to Korea, and then he came back and he got an MBA from NYU, and kind of wanted to get out of the city. I think he wanted to get away from family I don't know the whole reasons, but let's just say he wanted to try a different adventure. And my mom was all for that too. And they were going to go they were looking in the Northeast, like, Boston, Connecticut, even upstate New York, as a change of pace. And my dad ended up getting a job with Weyerhaeuser, the lumber company, and they moved him to St. Paul, Minnesota in the winter. And I have a brother who's 3 years older than I am, and he was born in Scarsdale. So when they moved, he was about 2 when they moved to Minnesota. And then they didn't stay in Minnesota very long, only maybe 9 months. Weyerhaeuser opened up a new headquarters in Washington State, which to me makes a lot more sense because all the trees are there. But so it was a big adventure that my parents took, to drive my brother in a station wagon, and a playpen across the country, and they moved to Tacoma. And I was born about a year later in Tacoma. So, and then they bought their first house in 1962, I think, in Gig Harbor, which is now basically a suburb of Tacoma, Seattle. But at the time, it was a little more rural country.
Is that where you grew up, Tacoma?
I grew up in Gig Harbor, yeah, which is by Tacoma.
Uh-huh.
Puget Sound. I grew up in Puget Sound.
Did it feel booming to you growing up? Was it rapidly growing?
Not so much as a young kid. Certainly, by the time, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I graduated. I went to college on the other side of the state, at Whitman College in Walla Walla, before I transferred down to Caltech. But I think in the 80s is when the 80s and 90s in particular is when the real boom took off in Washington State, in the Seattle area. So there were only, Weyerhaeuser was a fairly big employer, but the biggest employer in the Seattle area was Boeing by far.
Yeah.
And the economy was up and down depending on how many airplane sales Boeing had. They would hire 10,000 engineers and lay off 10,000 engineers when a program got done. So Starbucks, I don't know when that started, but it was pretty much after probably in the 80s-ish or maybe late 70s.
Suzy, was it public schools that you went to growing up?
It was. Where I grew up in Gig Harbor basically, it's much more suburbia now. It was much more rural. Mm-hmm. So it was a kind of a rural school district that carried a large geographical area. Yeah, very large geographical area. And fairly diverse, not in a ethnic way. Everybody was Caucasian, pretty much. Maybe a little Hispanic, but nearly all Caucasian. But what they did, if you lived close to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, you might have a parent who was pretty affluent because they worked at a job in the city. But further out, you're in the country, you're on a farm, you're in a little trailer, so you had that sort of mix of incomes in the school district, yeah.
Suzy, what do you remember of the space race in the 1960s, and did that plant a seed for you, do you think?
We used to watch, it was part of our curriculum, right? I can remember being in second grade and watching the astronauts return from the moon, right? 1968. I remember watching the splashdown. The funny thing is, though, it's probably funny looking back on it now. I thought that the frogman that jumped out of the helicopter to go swim to the capsule as it was floating in the Pacific, I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. I thought that looked like a lot of fun. Whether I really, wanted to be the astronaut going to the moon, maybe not. But
did you gravitate towards science and engineering growing up?
Yeah, I did. I mean, we grew up in a house on the water. We had a waterfront property, so I would do a lot of fishing. My parents got me, I think when I was 13, we got like a small boat with an outboard motor, and our friends, we would go out fishing, I guess is the best way to say it. Try to catch some salmon and run around in the boat. It has like a 15 horsepower motor on it or something, so.
And as a girl, with your parents or your teachers, did you ever feel discouraged that this was not, the best path for women, or were you encouraged?
No, actually, I think it was the latter. My dad obviously was very encouraging. Jen, you can do whatever you want. Even though, he was in the business end of the lumber world. And my mom was a homemaker she had worked in a test kitchen before she got married. So she was a really good cook. She sewed all those things that I never really picked up. uh, but it made for a great home life. And um, I never felt discouraged. I mean, from my family was always supportive, and in high school I had a math teacher who had he had two daughters also, and he was always very encouraging. I was good in the math and sciences. He wanted me to go to the Air Force Academy because that's where he went, but that wasn't an academy. Didn't really strike me as that exciting. But I never, even in college, I never really felt that discriminated against. So maybe
Was
if anything else, maybe you got a little more attention because you were not in the majority of the people taking engineering classes.
looking back in high school, did you have a strong curriculum in math and science?
Yeah, we were able to actually offer like a calculus A/B class for, and I think there were only 4 or 5 kids in it. So we were able to offer a AP class or a class that only had, 5 or 6 kids in it. And they offered that at the high school too. So, yeah, but it was also a high school that had a shop, wood shop and automobile shop, and I think it still does actually. You don't see a lot of technical kind of trade stuff at high schools much anymore, but we had that. We had that too.
When it was time to think about colleges, were you aware of Caltech? Did you know about its connection to JPL?
Um, I knew that it was a really good school, and I didn't. I when I went to look at colleges, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, you can use math in everything, right? You can use it in economics. You can make models that are political models, and so I didn't want to go head on into Caltech and be stuck in that route. So I went to Whitman College, which is a liberal arts college in Walla Walla, Washington. This is pre-wine. Everything in the 80s was wheat and asparagus and sweet onions. All the wine came in the mid to late 90s when all the people from San Francisco made a lot of money and moved up to the Northwest. Um, but yeah, I knew that Whitman had what they call a 3-2 program with Caltech. So you go 3 years and basically get training in liberal arts and all the math and science background classes that you needed for an engineering degree, but they didn't offer an engineering degree. So it was kind of the next step, and it gives you some time to determine what you really want to do with your career. But if you decide to go into engineering, you can go to one of the best schools in the country, and that's what I did. And I think it helps to make you a person, a much more well-rounded engineer.
Susie, are you aware, are there other schools that have this unique arrangement with Caltech, or what is it about Whitman that allowed them to do
Now,
this?
there were at the time, there were on the order of 8 to 10 schools that did this program. Occidental is one, Pomona College is another one, so local schools have it. I think the program has changed over the years, mostly from the Caltech side of it. I'm not sure exactly what Caltech thought they were getting out of it. I know what Whitman thought they were getting out of it. They were getting a chance to sort of offer an engineering program without offering an engineering program, essentially getting really bright students and giving them a liberal arts background before they went to get an engineering degree. But I think Caltech doesn't really do that too much anymore. The program is structured differently. I think they still have it, but I think it's structured differently. You have to, in my case, if you did well in the courses you took at Whitman, you automatically got accepted into Caltech for this exchange program. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that Caltech may either make you take a test or might just base your acceptance on what size enrollment they want to have. I do think what Caltech gets out of it is a way to offer, or at the time, what they got out of it was to get a more diverse population, more women for one, probably, and also just students with a different background. If you come into Caltech and you've had a bunch of liberal arts classes, history classes, political science classes, economic classes, and then you go into your engineering degree, I think it gives you, it's much different than the typical Caltech student who's been taking math and science, and maybe even taking, math and science at their local university before coming to Caltech. But they're very focused, right? And this is a way to get a population that's, I would say, more well-rounded.
Suzy, to clarify, so when you went to Whitman, you went on the basis that you would ultimately transfer to Caltech? That was the deal going in?
That was the option I knew I could do.
Yeah.
Right. So that was an option that was out there. And I knew if I wanted to do that, I could do that. But I didn't have to decide on my 18th birthday.
Yeah.
Right. I didn't have to go all into Caltech at 18 without really saying what else I might want to do. I mean, in high school, I didn't take a political science class, really. You take U.S. history, and you might take some world history. And heck, I took typing in high school, right? Like typewriter typing. So I just wanted a chance to really see more fields before I decided that I wanted to kind of go all in on the engineering side of it.
Now, is this to say that Caltech sort of has to pre-admit you? Are they part of your application decision if that's an option for you after 3 years?
The program was structured such that if your grades were good enough, yeah, Caltech would accept you. I think they changed the program in part because there was some abuse of it, probably by some liberal arts schools, or they would get a lot of foreign students that would come into Caltech this way. I don't really know the rationale for why they've changed it. I think they still have the program, though. It's just it's not as much of an automatic acceptance, and I'm sure there's probably less students that they admit under this program.
Suzy, what year did you start college?
I graduated from high school in 1979. So I started at Whitman in 79, and I went 3 years to Whitman. And so I left Whitman in the fall of 82. And so I was at Caltech 82, 83, 84 is when I graduated from Caltech.
What during your 3 years at Whitman solidified your decision to go to Caltech? What were your experiences?
Well, I think I continued to show myself that I was good at the math and sciences, and I like the math and sciences. I like that more than writing history papers about the Civil War, although I had a very good Civil War teacher. It made it very enjoyable, but I liked I had a good physics instructor at Whitman, and just kind of raced right through the regular math track. So yeah, I thought I could do it. And actually, going to Caltech from Whitman, even though you got a bachelor's degree from each school, one from Whitman and one from Caltech, it was really like going to grad school. You've done 3 years. And I think this was important too, because I've hung around Caltech a lot. Like my daughter went to Caltech. Caltech is a very tough school, a really tough school. You go from the top of your class in high school to the bottom of your class in college, and it challenges your psyche a little bit. Am I really good? Was I just an imposter in high school or stuff like that? But I think having the experience at Whitman and doing well at Whitman allowed me to handle going from the straight A student to the C- student. You get to Caltech and it's just a totally different world. And it's hard. It's really hard. And so the first term I was at Caltech, I did get, you know, in my mind, pretty bad grades. I think I can distinctly remember getting a D on a AMA 95 class my first term. Of course, the professor failed nearly the whole class, so there's some egos in the professor department too. You know, and I remember him saying, if you wanted it easy, you would have gone to Stanford. That's exactly what he said.
Uh-huh.
It's stuck with me all these years.
That's great.
I hope, you know, I don't deal with a lot of professors on campus, some in the astronomy department or math, physics, astronomy, but I hope that there is less ego in the professors on campus than was at that time. A little more kinder, gentler people. Doesn't mean your classes can't be hard, but you don't need to be so arrogant about it, right?
Yeah. That's about culture, less about the science.
Yeah, yeah.
Suzy, from the first class of women who came in 1970, by the time you arrived, did that all feel sort of normalized, or did there still feel something new about women undergraduates at Caltech?
Uh, well, honestly, I being even at Whitman, most of the classes, since if they were math and science classes, were more men than women.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in my career, it's always been, or my college career, it's always been more the 25 to 30% woman, which kind of was what it was at Caltech. It might have been maybe 25% women. I know they're close to half now, but um, there is. My daughter went to Caltech. Actually, brought this up too. You know, Caltech has the socially awkward and the awkwardly social, you know, set of people. Big Bang does a really good job of emulating some of the issues at Caltech from the standpoint of the student interactions between the male and the female students, you know. But I didn't ever feel like because I was a woman, either at Whitman or Caltech, that people didn't think I would succeed. I spent a lot of time going to office hours, and the professors, and even the grad students at Caltech that ran those office hours were always very open and helpful. You know, I don't believe I ever got any disparaging remarks about you won't make it in this field kind of thing.
Did you come in knowing that you wanted to focus on engineering, or you made that decision in real time?
Well, that's the program actually. The program is you come to Caltech at that time, and this may have changed a little bit too, but at that time the program was you're going to has an engineering major, and I went in. You don't go in and become a math major. You go in and become an engineering major, or chemistry major. It's the 3-2 program was just for engineering. Now you could do electrical engineering, or you could do what they called. They didn't at that time. They didn't have a straight mechanical engineering degree. They had a applied mechanics or something like that is what I got my degree in. But basically it was mechanical engineering. I took a couple double E classes and I said, no, this is not for me.
Why? What's the difference between EE and mechanical engineering for you?
Well, I think mechanical engineering is, you know, it's thermal analysis, it's fluid flows, it's classical mechanics like dropping a ball and rolling it down a chute, knowing what happens. It's very tangible, actually. You know, you think about mechanical engineering, you're touching things, you're building things, you're determining how heat flows across a system. Electrical engineering was more, I was going to say more, you know, I guess it was just more abstract to me. I guess that's the best way to say it. It's more abstract. You don't see the electricity going through the wire.
Suzy, what was your visibility for JPL as a Caltech undergraduate? Were you a surf student? Did you get to spend any time up on lab?
I did not work on lab. I actually spent a summer working at Weyerhaeuser, which was kind of interesting, looking at laser scanners for lumber, but that's a different story. But I was a swimmer, so I was on the swim team, and I would go to the gym and use the pool. And several of the people that I met there worked at JPL, and that's how I got my job at JPL. I was swimming with somebody who said, "Oh, I have a friend that's got a job on Voyager. It's hiring. You might be interested." So, and I interviewed, and they hired me, and the rest is history, I guess.
Tell me about the laser work at Weyerhaeuser. What was that about? What were you doing?
It was in their research and technology field. When they make lumber, uh, the best you need to it's graded, like this is like maple syrup is graded. This is class A lumber, this is class B lumber, and the grading has to do with um, how much pitch and knots and things like that are in the wood. You know what a knot? The knot is like where the branch grows out through the wood. So if you have a lot of sappy pieces in your lumber or a lot of knots, it's structurally not as good. And fast growing lumber, which they grow southern pines, there's softwood fast growing lumber, can vary a lot in the quality of the wood. So they at a mill they actually have people, and this was back in the 80s. They were trying to be efficient and cut down on the number of people that you need to operate a mill. Just the same way the cars wanted to get more efficient and have less people build a car in the process of building a car. So they were working on laser scanners that would essentially look for these defects in the lumber, could look for knots and look for sap and count that up, and then make an automatic determination if that's a class piece of lumber or a B class piece of lumber, instead of a person sitting there and looking at it. So you think of a laser as kind of how much light it reflects back. That the shiny parts, the sap, might reflect more light, whereas the hardwood might not, or vice versa. I don't even remember anymore. But it was a lot of algorithms and sort of trial and error about testing how to automatically do grading on lumber.
Suzy, when it was time to graduate, what were your options? What were you thinking in terms of industry or government service or graduate school?
Yeah, I had enough school with 5 years. I had enough school, and I didn't want. I had a professor at Caltech that really he showed me the numbers. Like if you get your master's, because I could stay at Caltech and get a master's in I think a year actually. As you stay and get your master's, um, you can get this much more pay, right? That's what he was telling me. But I had more than enough school. I said I'll probably get a master's, but I don't want it to be today. I don't want it to keep falling on. And so I was looking for jobs in engineering, and I had an offer from TRW right there in Redondo Beach area. I was working on intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is okay. I mean, it was by the beach. I had an offer in Colorado with Storage Technology Corporation, which I don't know, they make spinning discs of storage, or they did at the time. I'm sure they got bought out by somebody else and the technology changed. And I had an offer at JPL. And I took the one at JPL, which paid the least, but it was also in my mind. I like the Pasadena area, so I kind of wanted to stick around here. But it was also the sheer uniqueness of, you know, um, the offer was to work on Voyager. It was going to fly by Uranus in 2 years. And I was like, where else is happening in the world? Nowhere. It's happening right here at JPL, Caltech JPL. I want to be a part of that, and stay close to the campus. So yeah.
But no contact with JPL as a Caltech undergraduate.
Yeah, that's correct. Other than the people I met around Caltech that worked at JPL.
Do you think looking back there was a missed opportunity or even, in your subsequent career, are there more opportunities for Caltech undergraduates to have interface opportunities with JPL?
There certainly are now, yeah, and I know with our new director, Lori Leshin, that's a big deal, right?
Right.
I think both she and Tom Rosenbaum are looking for programs to enhance the interaction between campus and JPL, both for the professors but also for the students. I think now they have a program where every undergrad, at least that wants to, can come and get a tour of JPL in their freshman year. So
How did the opportunity come about? Did you answer a job ad? Did JPL come down to campus to recruit?
no, somebody I was swimming with in the next lane said my friend at JPL has some openings on Voyager. If you're interested, here's his name and number. So I called him. And after that, I probably applied for an official job ad. But yeah, that was, networks are everything. Networks are everything. So
Do you remember the date or at least the month when you started at JPL?
yeah, because I started before I graduated. I had enough credits that my last quarter at JPL, I was taking like two classes and a PE class. I think I don't know what, I might have been taking springboard diving for the heck of it or something. And so I started they wanted me to start early. And I said, well, I could start in May. And so I started in May of 84, and I graduated in June of 84. I
What
started as a contractor, though. The position was a contractor position. I worked for the Computer Science Corporation.
Computer
And
Science
then,
Corporation was a contractor for JPL.
yeah, yeah, the position was a contractor position. So I stayed as a contractor at JPL for the Uranus encounter. And then they offered me a direct Caltech JPL position in 1986 after the Uranus flyby. So I stayed for Neptune as well.
Tell me about your early impressions of JPL. What was it like?
Um, it was fun. I mean, it was fun to be part of a team. I was just talking to somebody else about what it's like to be in space operations. And I said, well, these projects are teams, right? It's great to be on a team and have a mission and all be working together. I was a very sports oriented kid for the most part, and enjoy the team aspect of work. And certainly Voyager, there wasn't near as many projects at JPL then as there are now, right? Voyager was the flagship mission, so most people on the lab were and somehow involved with that, or like I can remember the Magellan mission to Venus, and then they were starting on the Galileo mission too. So there were some other missions in progress, but right now we might have a dozen missions going on in astrophysics and planetary sciences and even heliophysics at JPL. And back then there were maybe 3 going on at the same time. But it was very exciting, and it was super exciting at the encounter time frame because they brought in these big trailers. I may have said this to you last time, but they brought in these big trailers for the press to be here. So that you had the press people on site. This is all sort of pre-internet, you did news by going there in person. And so you got to see all these newscasters go to Von Karman every day and listen to Ed Stone and the panel of scientists that were there. And it gave a great vibe to the laboratory. And I think some of that happens today. It certainly happens around like Mars landings and stuff. The press comes, but it was a bigger event during Voyager because that was the only way the press could get the information. They couldn't just do a Zoom call with somebody. So,
Suzy, what was your day-to-day like in the early years? What would it mean to show up for work and be part of the Voyager team?
I was working in the sequencing area, so you come in, you have a desk next to somebody else that comes in. Um, uh, this whole telework thing, quite a bit different than today.
Oh, yeah.
Quite a bit different. but you come in and it was a fairly routine thing. Like you'd be working on a sequence, and it takes 6 weeks to develop that sequence, and there's different steps and different software programs and different reviews. But that process then, repeats itself every 6 weeks. So from a work standpoint, you're doing a fair amount of the same thing, although you sometimes had special events. You sometimes work with a particular science team on a special calibration they wanted to do. And what I do remember is the Voyager team was, they were pretty the sequence area had a lot of pranksters in it. They would like fill a person's drawer with water and put fish in there. And so when they came in the next day, the water would splash and they'd have these goldfish swimming around in their desk. And it's that kind of a team camaraderie. And most people would eat lunch together too. So you just really were cohesive as a team.
What areas did you have real responsibility, even in the early years?
Well, I think one of my I hired in when 4 other people hired in. Voyager went through Jupiter and Saturn, and then it had a bathtub because it had 5 years to get out to Uranus. So a lot of people left because Jupiter and Saturn were bing. They're like maybe 2 years apart, 18 months to 2 years apart in encounters. And then there was this lull, so they had to cut. A lot of people left, or they just needed to trim staffing, a bathtub and staffing, because there was such a long duration. So I was part of the crew that came back in, new group of crew that came back in during Uranus. And there were 4 of us that hired in all at the same time to do basically the same job, which was sequencing. And so it was a very, basically a very junior job on Voyager, sequencing engineer, but a super exciting mission, right? Really gets you going for liking this type of work. And then when it came to Neptune, I got to be the lead sequence engineer. So of the 4 of us that were doing it, I got the closest approach sequence, okay?
Which means what?
The one that mattered the most scientifically, right? The most complicated sequence to build scientifically, the Neptune flyby sequence. So others would build sequences that led up to that, and I had the critical sequence, right? It's probably the best way to say it. I try to be a little bit modest about that, but essentially that was really cool, because everything you know about Neptune from Voyager, 90% of that's taken in a 12-hour time span, and that was the sequence I built. So
now, when you say 12-hour time span, that's just the length of the encounter?
Yeah, it's the length of what they call the closest approach flyby. You're going really fast past this planet. You're trying to cram all the different instruments being able to take data, the data that they need to get their science done, and they all want to do it at the same time. Ed Stone had to decide, build some consensus with the science team about what's the most critical science and whose instrument gets to go point where, when type thing. But putting all that together, working with the scientists to lay it out, getting the calibrations in there that needed to be in there. It took a lot of time, took a lot of care. And then when you finally send it up, it's like, fingers crossed, I hope it goes okay, and Neptune was a long way away. It's nothing compared to Voyager now, but it was, I think, 4.5 hours, over 4-hour light time, one-way light time. Again, everything, you see the data on the ground, everything's already happened 4 hours earlier.
When you say light time, what does that mean?
That's the time it takes for the signal to go from the spacecraft to the Earth.
Right. Just to show how much farther away it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's the distance from the sun to the Earth is 1 astronomical unit. So Neptune's at 30 astronomical units. So that's the difference.
Suzy, this is a question that might make it feel like a very long time ago, but what were computers like at JPL in the mid-1980s?
Um, they're in history museums. Yeah. So when I first started, I started on I don't even remember the name of it, but I do recall I had an 8-inch floppy drive. That was our command medium, an 8-inch floppy drive, not a memory stick, not even a CD. Um, and uh, we worked on when we did these designs and plots of that showed there's a program that you could design an observation like you want to make a mosaic over Uranus, and you could lay out the observation, and then it would tell you what the commands you need to do it are. That was done on a UNIVAC computer, so like kind of more of a mainframe refrigerator sized computer. And it was really slow, really slow. You would start something in the morning and grab a cup of coffee and come back 2 hours later. And we didn't have 2 hour coffee breaks, don't get me that wrong, but you'd have to check on it during the day to see if it's progressed and it hadn't just crashed. So, yeah, they were kind of dinosaurs for sure.
Suzy, looking back, that first promotion that you got, did you see that as putting you on a trajectory toward leadership?
Um, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is it acknowledged that I was a very capable engineer, right? I would say that part of it, not necessarily like up into the management role at all. Because when Voyager ended, then you're like, well, what's my next job going to be? Where do
Right.
I go? What's the next project? And you're kind of at a stopping point a little
Yeah.
bit, a reflection point. What do
So
I want to do?
on that very point, what was your sense, during the heyday of Voyager, right in the middle of the encounters? What was JPL's second act? What was in the works at that point?
Well, Galileo was definitely in the works. Trying to remember when Galileo. I think Galileo was originally supposed to launch in '89, and then it had the whole issue with the stuck antenna, so it came back and it launched later. And they were starting on Cassini. Um, the development in Cassini was originally going to be Craft Cassini, two spacecraft. Or Craft was a Comet Rendezvous asteroid flyby mission that got canceled. But I went on to Mars Observer, and I got to do instead of sequencing, I did mission planning, and I had a very small group of people that I worked with, like two people. There were three of us total, and we did the mission planning, and I was the lead of that 3-person group. Um, but Mars Observer failed,
Yes. Yeah.
and right about that time is when after that happened, I got onto Cassini, which had a lot more of the same people that were on Voyager, especially from a science standpoint. And Cassini, I got on Cassini, I think in 93, yeah, 93, fall of 93, and they didn't launch till 96. So we were in the process of designing software, implementing our processes and our software to be able to build sequences. So
Suzy,
that wasn't. I got a much bigger team then. I had like 40 people on that team at one point.
for
So,
your time on Voyager, what was most exciting for you?
uh, well, good engineers like to do things that are out of the box. Like there was a time there was a supernova explosion between, when we were cruising between Uranus and Neptune, and um, we all wanted to look at it, and our manager was a little bit hesitant, like, no, that takes away from the daily thing we want to do, and say, no, we want to do this. We like, engineers like a challenge. They'd much rather be doing technical things than the same thing over and over again. So we got to change our sequence, make a change midstream, do a sequence that looked at this supernova, particularly with the ultraviolet spectrometer, and so I think that that sense of being able to do something like a target of opportunity is one of the terms people use. That was that was kind of proof that we as a team could change course and we didn't have to do everything the same way all. But I go back to like the Neptune encounter because I had the closest approach sequence because it was also sort of teary-eyed because it was the last flyby of Voyager. Every Voyager, yeah, 2 to 3 years from now the mission will end, right? And that was 30, 32 years ago. People thought that, so it's still going, but quite a bit different mission. But it was certainly the end of the planetary mission, and having the Neptune encounter, having it be successful, participating in some of the media stuff like Neptune All Night. I'm sure you've watched that of me as a young looking child, very nervously interviewing a scientist. And then the whole party that the Planetary Society had on the mall. Just can't beat that. I don't think I've seen anything as good as that since.
Suzy,
maybe for Voyager's 50th we'll do that.
There you go. To give a sense of the size of the Voyager team and also Ed Stone's accessibility, did you interact with him during your Voyager years? Would you have been able to?
I didn't interact too much with him directly, no. I mean, I may have sat in a few meetings where he was talking, leading the scientists and stuff. But he had each instrument team had experiment reps who sort of represent. They were JPL scientists who represented the on-site represented the science teams who were usually at universities. So I interacted a lot with the experiment reps. But again, they were JPL employees. But Ed Stone, all you knew about Ed Stone is he walked really fast.
Right.
He walked really, really fast.
The Energizer Bunny.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense? Did you have a sense of his leadership style from your mentors?
I certainly do now, having worked with him during the Interstellar Mission, and then talking with folks like Linda Spilker and others that were part of the science team meetings, and really used Ed as a role model for Linda. She was a project scientist on Cassini, so trying to use what he did as a role model. But Ed, I've talked to Ed over the years, over the last 10 or 15 years about just what he tried to do to lead science teams. Because scientists they understand the greater good, but they want their instrument to be higher up than, it's not so much higher up than another instrument, but they all understand they have to fight for their science.
Some science objectives are more equal than others.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the way that Ed was able to listen to everybody, summarize the key points, and then kind of get everybody in agreement, or acceptance might be a better way to say it. Doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but everybody accepts it. Really a great role model for a project scientist, yeah.
Suzy, on that point, did you have a sense in the 1980s how scientists and engineers worked together or not for Voyager, that blend of engineering possibilities with science objectives?
There's a very much difference between scientists and engineers, and I think actually that's kind of one of my strengths, and I probably got it a lot from Voyager and a little bit from Mars Observer too, because Mars Observer was a young crowd of scientists. They were all grad students on Viking, and then they got to be PIs on Mars Observer. People like Phil Christensen or Mike Malin, who are kind of movers and shakers in the world now in science, but they speak a different lingo. So and their objectives are different. The engineers like to solve problems. The scientists like to understand how the mechanisms of how something works and look for discoveries. So the engineers are enablers of the science. So there's a synergy. The engineers don't have a job unless the scientists have good, questions that they want to answer, right? And then the scientists don't get the data unless they work with the engineers to be able to solve the problems to get them the data. But that's actually one area I really feel I do well, and that I'm happy that I can do this well, which is just helping communications between scientists and engineers and seeing both sides of it. I think that helped a lot when I worked on Spitzer, because I was working in the science center.
Yeah.
And I was trying to tell the engineers at JPL, this is what the scientists are trying to do, and don't think of them as, no, stupid scientists don't understand the issues. They do, but they also have valid reasons for wanting to do certain operations. So,
Suzy, on that point, and last question for today, given all of the miracles of Voyager, both all of the discovery and the engineering that continue to allow the spacecraft to exist, what was it? What was that perfect blend of engineering and science that you saw from your perspective in the 1980s that helps explain what Voyager is able to do?
I think, well, for one thing, I think, since being the project scientist project manager for the last 12-ish years, the engineers on Voyager are extremely dedicated to it, right? They've been there. There's a core group of people that have been there since Uranus. Neptune and Uranus has the engineers, has the attitude control engineers, has the telecom engineer. So they are intimately familiar with the spacecraft. It's a big challenge now because people are retiring out, and how to get that knowledge capture is difficult. It's difficult in particular because this mission has always been like, it'll last 3 more years. Even when VIM was approved in 1990, I don't think people thought it would go for more than 5 years. Matter of fact, I've heard that from some NASA people at the time. We were at 30 AU, and they said we'd cross the heliopause at 550 AU, and we crossed it at 122 AU. So it's always been a mission of like 4 or 5 years at a time, and so we've never planned to have a 45-year mission or a 50-year mission.
Yeah,
we certainly have that goal now, and the value of the data is extremely unique and important if you want to study interstellar space and the heliopause. But I think getting back to your original question, as I digressed, you were looking for how the scientists and engineers worked together?
Yeah, what was that blend of engineering capabilities with science objectives that just made Voyager what it was?
I think there was a respect between the engineers and the scientists. I was not on the project in the first 5 years of the project, first 6 years of the project. So I'm sure there were much more rough times in interactions between scientists and engineers, and
that got smoothed out by the time you got there.
Yeah, that got smoothed out over time. Yeah, I'm sure that there was a lot more rough patches in personalities and in even in leadership.
Yeah,
who's really leading the project. The project manager who listens to the engineers, or the project scientist. So you definitely have to have a good project has a good working relationship between the project scientist and the project manager. Absolutely need that. If there's any little chips in there or any little clinks where they don't see eye to eye, that can really undermine the success of a project.
Well, happily, it sounds like you came in right at the perfect time when all that got smoothed out.
Yeah. I think it took some time. I don't have the earliest history of Voyager, but by the time I was there, I think everybody kind of knew each other and people hung on mostly for Neptune. I think a lot of people hung on, right? And then there was like a big transition because the staff went way down.
Right. Well, Suzy, on that note, we'll pick up big changes are coming next in the 1990s for you, Mars Observer. Ed Stone becomes director, and of course, the end of the Cold War and what that means for JPL. So we'll pick up next time.